This episode where I go through the source code of flag library within Go language. Flag library is a library for dealing with command line arguments within Go programs. Starting with the remark that most programming languages have some sort of a main function that is given an array of arguments and sometimes a count of arguments as well, which then people use different kind of libraries to parse the arguments, parse the variables that are there, and to form an object model of it. So Go programming language, being one of the newer languages out there, learned from the lessons from other languages and made command line parsing a first-class supported feature within the language. Before we go into the source code, let's take a look at how the flags are used within Go language. So this is straight from the example tests within the Go language source code. And what you see here is this is how you define that your program needs a command line flag. And this you're putting in a variable which is called a string type, so it's typed. And the command line argument itself is called species and has a default value of gopher, and this is a description. So if you used your command with a help argument, then you are going to see this help text automatically produced by the library. So now, of course, this is where using one way of using the flag. This is a different way of using the flag. In this case, you're defining a variable, and you are using a longer version of gopher type, but also aliasing it to a shorthand version. In both cases, you are assigning it to the address of the same variable. That way the user can decide whether or not they want to use the longer version or shorter version of the command line argument. So I already mentioned that this is a typed argument. In this case, it was a string, but you could also define your own type to parse the arguments. And in this case, they are defining a new type of command line, which is a time duration. And if you define your new type, all you need to do is to define a string method and a set method. In this case, the set is essentially just adding it to an array. So you can provide multiple arguments in this format. It says your intervals are 10 seconds and 15 seconds, something you could use in something like a cron program. And again, the way you use the variable is same. You just say flag.var instead of a flag.string. Give it the reference, of course, give it the name, and then you give it a description of it. So if you call your program, the description will be auto-printed for you. There is also subcommands, which I'm not going to show right away, but let's go to the source code to see how this is all implemented. It's a fairly straightforward code. We have already seen how to use it, so let's just go straight into the code. Defines a few errors, and then one thing you see, so this is natively the Golang flag package supports Boolean flags, and this is how you create a new Boolean, and then there's a set method as we just saw. There's a get method, string method, and some question methods as well. In terms of code critic, where I see it interesting is when you go from bool to the integer type of flags, you will see that they look very similar. If you look at these methods, they're very similar methods. The set methods are very similar as well. So this is where some of you already know Go language doesn't have support for generics. So you'll have to re-implement a whole bunch of methods, even though they share the same structure for type safety. So again, the same pattern repeats here, where with generics, they could have just written one method instead of one method for each of those types that are very, very similar. But we can see that it supports Boolean, integers, and then unsigned integers of 64-bit. Then, of course, strings is supported as well, and duration is supported. So now float is supported as well. and that's time duration. So internally, there's a thing called value, and there's a getter interface, and this is how subcommands are supported. So if you want git-like subcommands, so git status and then different arguments passed to it, then you can use flag set to fork off your subcommand, and then you can have different handlers for each subcommand as well. So a flag set is essentially a map of flags, and each flag has a name, usage string, value, and default value that we already saw in the example. And the rest of it is essentially a bunch of setters and getters for those properties. So this code is fairly straightforward. I like the fact that the language takes good care of command line parsing, allows you to do type safe command line parsing, and you can even define your custom types to be provided based on the command line. Subcommands are also part of it, which is amazing to see a language going that length in the language itself so that you can build first-class command line interfaces for your programs. There's no support for array type flags by default, which I found a little bit surprising because it's again a common feature in command lines. Sometimes you need multiple values. I think the lack of generics made it more expensive to get it in the language. But you can write your own if you really need to support array. Again, that's something I would expect that the language could have provided. The lack of generics made this code full of duplicates in many cases, as we have seen. And maybe in a newer version of Golang, when they build support for generics, they can collapse a lot of these methods into a single implementation. So if you see, again, the set methods between the int64 and unsigned int, they're very, very similar, only differing in the type information. I hope you have had a good time going to the flag interface, and hopefully you'll use it. Thank you for your time on this episode. We'll see you later. Bye.